All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective, by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 1. Summer, 1971. Sirius Black was awake. He doubted that he would ever sleep again. His entire body was alive with energy, buzzing, as if he could feel the magic fizzing in his veins. This was unfortunate, as it was well past midnight and there was nothing he could do but lie in bed. His mother had begun sending Creature, the wretched little snitch, to check on him after one fateful night when she had discovered Sirius under the covers with a Muggle magazine. She had been furious, ranting about how her niece was poisoning his mind and contaminating the purity of the noble family. There had also been a lot about Dromeda's perverted obsessions with mundanity, a line which Sirius had thought his cousin would actually find quite funny. It wasn't funny when Walpurga was screaming it, face twisted up into a frightening snarl. The magazine wasn't even Andromeda's. Sirius had nicked it from a bin 2 weeks back. He'd shown it to Reg, and they'd laughed about the silly, unmoving pictures. Tonight, though, none of that mattered, because tomorrow Sirius was going to Hogwarts. Hogwarts. Just thinking about the name made him giddy, and he grinned up at the dark panelled ceiling of his room. He felt like laughing. He wanted to throw off the covers and jump up and down on the overlarge mattress. Hogwarts! It was all he'd wanted since he could remember. The shining light at the end of what felt like a very dark tunnel. All summer he'd been up at the crack of dawn, racing downstairs to check the post. His mother's sharp reprimands that he behaved with decorum had not been enough to thwart his excitement, nor had the punishment she doled out with her commands were ignored. He didn't care about washing a few dishes or dusting a few old cabinets, and the fact that the chores were the worst of it made Sirius think that secretly his mother must be just a little bit excited too, maybe even proud of him, just a little. Surely, if she was truly angry, she'd have done much worse. When the letter did come, Sirius had whooped with joy and grabbed Reggie's hands, swinging them around in circles until they collapsed onto the living room floor, giggling. "Can you believe it, Reg? I'm actually off to Hogwarts," Sirius sighed blissfully. His little brother smiled, although there was a hungry glint in his eyes. He stared at the letter clutched in Sirius's hands. "I wish I could go with you," he said, rolling over so that he was lying on his back, staring up at the ceiling. "You'll be there next year, and we'll be housemates, living in dorms together, and I can show you around, tell you which professors are nice and all that." Regulus dug his fingers into the plush carpet beneath them. "Suppose," he said, and then, after a short pause, "Won't be the same round here without you, though." Sirius stiffened. "Course it won't," he said. "Be a lot more boring, eh?" Even to his own ear the cheer sounded forced, but Regulus smiled vacantly. "Yeah," he said. "Right." They left it at that. Walpurga Black refused to take her son shopping to Diagon Alley, and Sirius knew better than to think any amount of pleading or bargaining would change her mind. The noble family of Black was above mixing with the crowds of half-bloods and mudbloods that were sure to flood the place. She said it was bad enough that the State Dumbledore had let things get at Hogwarts. "I mean, really," she sniffed over the dinner on the night that Sirius had received his letter. "They used to have standards. Maybe a few half-bloods here and there, but I heard from Dromedary Lestrange that nearly a quarter of the incoming class are mudbloods. Can you imagine?" Her husband nodded solemnly in agreement, mouth twisted as though he had just eaten something sour. "Sirius," he said, turning to his son, "you'll stay away from those sort. Understand?" "Yes," Sirius muttered, poking unenthusiastically at his dinner. He was secretly quite curious about Muggleborns. He'd never met one before. His parents insisted that they were all incompetent, the dregs of wizarding kind. But if so many were getting into Hogwarts, they couldn't all be awful, could they? And if Andromeda had run off to marry a Muggleborn, then there had to be something interesting about them, didn't there? Otherwise, why go through all the fuss? Walpurga tutted loudly. "Sit up straight, boy, and stop playing with your food this instant." Sirius straightened immediately, and hated himself for it. He let his shoulders slouch in front of him a little bit defiantly, but his mother didn't seem to notice this small rebellion. She was still going on about Hogwarts. I mean, what's next? Goblins? House elves? Dumbledore has to draw the line somewhere. There was no diagonally for Sirius. The Black family's private seamstress came to measure him for a new set of robes, and Walpurga sent Creature out with a list of books and supplies that Sirius would need. He didn't even get to choose his own owl from the Black family owlery. His parents saw to that, presenting him with a spiteful beast that nipped at his fingers whenever he went to open its cage. The only good part was the wand. The Black family heirloom, sorted away until the heir came of age to use it. Even though Sirius had turned 11 in November of 1970, his mother had refused to let him touch it until the summer before he'd left for Hogwarts. "A wand is earned," she'd said to him, voice cold and sharp as ice, when he opened the empty box on his birthday. For the rest of the year, any bad behaviour was met with threats. "You are the heir to this family, Sirius. If you do not wish to accept the responsibilities that come with that title, then you will never earn the privileges it bestows either." Sirius tried his best. Really, truly he did. He sat still in lessons. He and Regulus were homeschooled. Another reason Sirius was dying to get to Hogwarts. Aside from the children of the stuffy pureblood families, Sirius had never been able to make any friends his own age, and parroted back his parents' teachings in his essays. He mentioned family trees and French conjunction. He wrote fewer letters to Andromeda, and he was sneaker about sending them too. It was never enough, of course. There were still arguments and punishments, and nights when he climbed into bed, wincing on bandaged legs. Sometimes Sirius hated himself for his inability to let go, to just give in and play the proper son that knew his parents so desperately wanted. He wished that he could exercise the stubborn part of his heart that screamed at injustice, the bit that felt like a kick in the gut. That isn't fair. That's wrong. That infuriating instinct to just scream no. But he couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard he tried. The more Sirius attempted to fit in, the more he became aware of his complete inability to do so, like trying to jam a puzzle piece into a board when it just isn't shaped right. For the entire year, Sirius felt like something with its edges scraped raw. Still, he managed. He was good. Mostly. Good enough that when the time came, he got his wand. Walpurga insisted on a traditional bestowal ceremony, which meant all the family members Sirius hated, and the stuffy, scratchy dress robes, and hours of speeches about purity and lineage and the Black family name. He tried not to squirm too much. Just a few more weeks. Just a few more weeks, and then I'm going to Hogwarts. It was actually quite nerve-wracking, having to stand in front of all his relatives and take the wand. Sirius had never touched it, had never even seen it, but he was well aware of the age-old motto, "The wand chooses the wizard." What if this wand didn't choose him? What if it could sense that there was something wrong, that he didn't fit in? As Sirius stood to accept the crystal-lined case, it felt like a distinct possibility. For a moment, as he opened the box, he was sure that the wand would reject him, proving to his family, once and for all, the secret fear that curled hidden in his heart, that Sirius wasn't truly worthy of being a Black at all, that he never would be. There was an oath that he was supposed to say. Sirius recited the memorized words, more horseshit about family legacy, blood purity, blah blah blah, without thinking about them. Instead, he stared down at the wand. It was elm, 9.5 inches, dragon heartstring, and it seemed to glow softly in the light. As Sirius finished the oath, his family chanted, "Toujours pur." "Toujours pur," he repeated. His throat had gone dry. There was a short pause. Sirius looked up and met his mother's eyes. She was frowning, glaring meaningfully at their assembled relatives, who were all waiting for him to do something. Walpurga raised her eyebrows slightly, as if to say, "Just pick the bloody thing up." So he did. There was a rush of heat, of energy, a sort of tingle, as if stars were shooting up from his fingertips and spreading through his entire body. Sirius gasped, smiling. The wand seemed to almost hum in his hand, as if it were greeting him like an old friend. "It chose me," Sirius thought, giddy. As if in response, a stream of light burst out from the wand. Sirius felt a tug in his gut, like something was pulling the magic from him. It wasn't forceful, more guiding, like the wand was showing him what to do. He released a startled laugh, following the wand's lead, pushing more magic into dizzying spirals of tiny fireworks that leapt away from the wood to crackle over his relatives' heads. There were hums of awe and delight, scattered applause, a buzz of chatter as people began to disperse, turning to talk and find refreshments now the ceremony was over. When Sirius looked up again, his mother was smiling. There was still something of a smirk about it. Walpurga Black was beautiful, but there was nothing kind in her features, and the tilt of her lips meant that any smile looked somewhat haughty at best. But she was proud. Undeniably, it was proud, and it was directed at him. "Well now," she sniffed, a smile playing across her lips. "You may just make a fine heir yet." Sirius felt like his heart might burst with joy. Chapter 2. First Year. The Hogwarts Express. It didn't last, of course. It never did with Walpurga. In the years that followed, Sirius sometimes wondered if the good memories had really happened, or if they were just dreams, fantasies that he convinced himself were real so that he could keep going. Had she really smiled at him that day? Had she really been proud? In the years to come, the memory would grow dimmer, foggier, until Sirius could never truly be sure that it happened at all. On the morning they left for the Hogwarts Express, his mother was decidedly not proud. Sirius had thought he might be able to ride the high of the successful wand-bestowing ceremony, to scrape through the last few weeks of summer quietly and be on his way, but this was not to be. It was just Regulus. He had grown more withdrawn the closer it got to September, more distracted. Sirius had been trying not to think too much about it, because any time he did, it felt like a fist was closing over his heart. They'd always had each other, the Black boys. Each other and not much else. The problem was that Reg was sweet. He always had been. Even as a little kid, at that age when kids are supposed to be bratty and drive everyone around them up the wall, there was a softness to him that was too close to weakness. He saved worms from drowning in the gutter. He cried when Walpurga shouted, which only made her shout more. Sirius learned very young and very quickly that no one else is going to protect his baby brother. It had to be him, or Reg would have no one at all. And besides, it was one thing to have his mother at his throat, screaming in his ear. Sirius could take that. But if she set in on Reg, and Sirius watched his little brother's lips start to tremble, heard him start taking those quick, funny breaths that meant he was trying not to cry, Sirius couldn't stomach it. He actually had thrown up one time, when he was 7 and Reg had just turned 6. Poor Reg had wet the bed. It was an accident, just kid stuff, a nightmare. Even at 7, Sirius was old enough to understand that. He was old enough to understand that his mother shouldn't scream at her child for that, shouldn't dig her nails into his arm and drag him off the bed and pull his trousers down, pointing her wand at his legs like she was going to... That's when Sirius had vomited. Walpurga had turned to him with hellfire in her eyes. Her anger was like a blade. Only now it was pointed at Sirius and not Reg. But that was all right. Sirius had got his first scar ages ago. It wasn't anything he couldn't live through. But seeing Reg's unblemished legs, still chubby with baby fat, smooth and vulnerable, seeing his mother's wand pointed at them, that was what had made Sirius sick. After that, it was like Sirius had discovered some sort of secret code. When being good didn't work, and it never did, not for long, when one of them made a mistake, he just had to make sure that his was worse. That was all it took to keep Reggie safe. It was worth it. So as they left for King Cross Station, Sirius couldn't take the guilt that cobbled across his heart, clinging to him. It wasn't as if his parents would ever let him stay back, would ever let him wait a year just so that he could go to Hogwarts at the same time as Reg. But maybe a better brother would have tried. Maybe a better brother wouldn't have been so excited to leave. The best that Sirius could do was to be bad. Once he had secured his wand, he spent the rest of the summer rebelling in every small way he could think of. He tracked mud through the house. He snuck out of his room at night and crept around the library until Creature found him. He nicked more Muggle magazines. It was a delicate balance, initiating his mother's anger, but ensuring that it was focused on solely him. There couldn't be any spillover. He needed to make sure that Reg looked like an angel once he left, and not a punching bag for any pent-up frustration with the black air. But Sirius thought he had managed all right. The downside to his rebellion was that Walpurga refused to allow Regulus to accompany them to the station. "He doesn't need a second more of your influence." They'd had to settle for a sniffly goodbye at the house, presided over by their mother, who glared like she would wallop them both if a single tear spilled over their watery eyes. "I'll miss you," Regulus said, voice a bit pitchy. "Promise you're right." "Course I will. Can't miss you hearing about all my adventures." Sirius grinned broadly, hoping to set his brother at ease. He leaned in for a hug, and Reg clung to him, burying his face in Sirius's neck. He took the chance to whisper, "Look, just play nice, all right? You're good at that. Keep your chin up. You're a saint compared to me, yeah?" Regulus pulled back, nodding and sniffling. A wary confusion clouded his eyes. He blinked and then started to say, "Sirius, you don't—" "That's that, then," their mother interrupted. "We're off, or we'll be late. Come along, boy." He'd been boy for the past 2 weeks, ever since Sirius accidentally knocked over a vase whilst trying to hide from Creature. Apparently it was something important, a family heirloom from some stuffy old geezer who probably married his cousin. Sirius thought he'd been ugly anyway. He gave his brother one last smile as they left, turning around to see Reg's small framed silhouette in the doorway. The station was everything he'd imagined. More, even. There were so many families, so many children. Sirius had never been in a room with so many people his own age. And the train, it was a beauty, a metal dragon spitting steam from the tracks. "Don't gawk," his mother snapped. "Have some dignity." Sirius blinked and looked down sheepishly, then petulantly lifted his chin again, refusing to give in to his mother's orders, even if his first instinct was to still jump at her every word. Pathetic, he thought. He held his head high as they walked through the station, aware of the looks that other wizards were casting their way. He heard his name muttered by a few of them, the Blacks, snatches of hushed conversation that died out of earshot as he walked by. Walpurga seemed used to the attention. She had her shoulders thrown back and her head held high, staring haughtily at the wizards who jumped out of their way. She looked regal. Sirius felt very aware of who he was, and exactly what everyone saw when they looked at him. "Toujours peur." He lifted his chin a bit higher, then felt foolish, so ducked it again. They were waylaid by a well-dressed witch who looked vaguely familiar. Sirius thought she might be a distant cousin. For a moment he listened as his mother began to speak with her hushed tones about which families were sending children to Hogwarts this year, discussing blood status and staring nastily out at some of the other wizards. "Did you hear about the Pettigrews?" the witch murmured. Their daughter. Sirius zoned out. He had had quite enough gossip about who was in the wizarding world. It was hardly any fun when he never got to meet any of the people his parents talked about. His father had already made sure that Sirius memorized the names of every pureblood family at Hogwarts, and had instructed him to which ones to avoid. Not that Sirius was planning to follow any of those instructions. He didn't want to spend the whole year with only his cousins for company. Bored, Sirius let his eyes drift to the train. He blinked. There was a boy with his face pressed up against the window, doing what could only be described, in the words of Walpurga Black, as gawking. He looked to be about the same age as Sirius, but that was where the similarities ended. Even through the carriage window, Sirius could see the boy's clothes were shabby, hand-me-downs probably, from an older sibling. He had his head had been shaved, leaving nothing but fuzz that stuck straight out. He had a broad mouth and full lips, which were hanging open a bit, and his eyes were wide and glassy. One of them One of them was blackened, a sign of a recent fight. When their eyes met, Sirius felt his heart kick anxiously in his chest, but he couldn't look away. Determined to project the facade of a cool confidence, Sirius only raised an eyebrow, challenging, as if to say, "What are you looking at?" The boy made a face, bulging out his chin with his tongue and crossing his eyes. Sirius's lips twitched, curling up into a smirk without even meaning to, and he saluted the boy by throwing up 2 fingers. The broad mouth split into a grin that changed his entire face, lighting up. "Sirius, what do you think you're doing? Come here at once!" Walpurga swept forward and yanked her son away from the window roughly. Sirius rolled his eyes and followed her up the platform, not quite sure why his heart was racing. It was just his luck that Narcissa was arriving at the exact moment that Sirius was ready to board the train. His mother sent him on with his cousin, giving Sirius a very clear instruction that he was to remain with her for the duration of the train ride, and not, under any circumstances, mix with the blood traitors or the impure. Narcissa didn't exactly look thrilled to be saddled with the kid cousin either, but she smiled politely at her aunt and brought Sirius on board, muttering, "Follow me," as they towed their suitcases down the hall. "Right then." She stopped outside the carriages. "This is where I'm supposed to be meeting my friends." Her lip curled as she looked at Sirius, making it very clear that his presence was an unwanted intrusion, but not one that she was resigned to suffer. "Have fun then," Sirius said quickly. "I'm off." "What? Your mother said you were to stay with me." Narcissa's voice had gone high and reedy. Clearly she was displeased with the arrangement, and hadn't intended to actually disobey direct instruction from Walpurga Black. Probably she had just been planning to snipe at him the whole train ride, making sarcastic comments about what a pain it was that she got stuck with him in her carriage. No thank you, Sirius thought. He had other plans. "Did she?" He was already backing away, holding his suitcase between them like a shield. "I think you must have misheard." He turned and scampered off as Narcissa called out behind him. "You little... If I get in trouble for this, you'll be hexed all term. Do you hear me? Sirius... Oh, bollocks!" Sirius heard the carriage door open and slam shut, and he smiled to himself as he hurried down the hall. The train had already begun to move, but Sirius took his time, peeking in windows until he finally found the person he'd been looking for. There were 2 other boys in the carriage now, a little mousy one with a pointed nose and watery eyes, and a boy with messy black hair and glasses. It looked as though they were in the middle of a conversation. Sirius steadied himself, taking a deep breath. "Just make friends," he told himself. "It's easy. Just be cool. You're Sirius bloody Black, for God's sake. Just be cool." The door swung open, and he sauntered in, interrupting whatever they were talking about. The 3 boys turned to look at him, and he made a show of glancing about furtively. "None of you are related to me, are you?" he drawled. The boy with the black eye was looking at him. His lip twitched down when Sirius spoke. Shit, Sirius thought. Have I ballsed it up already? But then the one with the glasses grinned, saying, "Don't think so." He held out one hand. "James Potter." "Thank God." "Oh, good, a Potter. Dad told me not to talk to you lot." Sirius sat down on the empty seat, heart pounding. Sirius Black. Chapter 3. First Year. The Sorting. "So, where do you lads think you'll end up?" James asked. They were nearing the school now, and students were starting to change into their uniforms. "I'm hoping for Gryffindor." "Gryffindor?" Sirius scrunched up his nose. "Really?" His father had always said Gryffindor was full of hot-blooded idiots. James didn't seem offended by the skepticism. He smiled broadly, unselfconsciously, as he said, "Yeah, my dad was a Gryffindor. I think it's the coolest, don't you?" Sirius thought that James was the coolest, so maybe his opinion counted for something. James Potter was friendly and self-assured, the heir to one of the oldest pureblood families, but one that wasn't as concerned with blood purity as the Blacks, judging by how Sirius's parents had warned him away from them. James had an easy, laid-back confidence that somehow didn't come off as entitled. Perhaps it was because he treated Peter, his chubby, undersized friend, with such genuine kindness. Peter, in return, seemed to worship James. He was from a pure-blood family, too. Peter Pettigrew. Sirius recognized the name. The Pettigrews were notorious for turning out squibs, and none of them were very powerful. Plus, there had been some scandal with Peter's older sister recently. Apparently she was nearly as bad as Andromeda. Peter, for his part, seemed a nervous wreck, clinging to James like a lifeline. Although the question had been directed at Sirius, it was Peter who answered, squeaking eagerly. "I do! I want to be in Gryffindor too, James." Sirius had to stop himself from rolling his eyes. He was sure that Peter would just pick whatever house James said was the best. "What's a Gryffindor?" the other boy interrupted. "Lupin, that was his name. Remus Lupin." When Sirius heard it, he thought for sure it was a wizard name. But Sirius had never heard his parents mention the Lupins, and judging by the state of his dress, Sirius doubted they ran in the same circles as the Blacks. Remus didn't talk much, just watched them with those big round eyes, looking confused by much of the conversation. Sirius wondered if he'd guessed wrong with the name. Could a Muggle have named their son Remus? James looked as if he'd been waiting for this question his entire life. He launched into an explanation about the Hogwarts houses, which made Peter groan. Sirius sighed as well, but secretly he was quite interested. He'd never heard anyone other than his family discuss the houses, and it was a bit of a shock to get a new perspective. "So, Gryffindor," James was saying. "It's all about loyalty, bravery, honour." "They've all got bollocks for brains." Sirius could hear the echoes of his father's voice after having an extra glass of wine at the Lestranges' dinner party. "Hufflepuff is all about acceptance. They're really, kind, I suppose. And they've got a lot of hidden talent, I think." James clearly wasn't as enthusiastic about the other houses, but he was trying to find something nice to say. "Full of mudbloods," Walpurga's voice hissed inside of Sirius's head. "Ravenclaws are really clever. Their houses are about brains and creativity, I suppose. They've got good minds, some of them, but their heads are all stuck in the clouds. And Slytherin, well, they're supposed to be, cunning, I suppose. I don't really understand how that's a difference from being smart, but they're ambitious too, honestly. A lot of dark wizards have come from Slytherin, almost all of them, actually. Slytherin is the house of nobility. Anyone who's going anywhere is a Slytherin. I'd steer clear if I was you, mate," James said with a last final nod at Remus. A heads up between mates. "Reckon I'll be a Slytherin," Sirius said, frowning. James looked at him, bemused. "Oh, come on, surely not." The words were said as if in reassurance. Sirius wondered if James had already had this conversation with Peter, or one like it. Sirius raised an eyebrow. "My whole family is a Slytherin. Big tradition. Hasn't been a black in another house for 500 years. Now James could see that he'd put a foot in his mouth. Flushed, he said awkwardly, "Oh, sorry, mate. I didn't realise. Well, cheers. I'm sure there'll be plenty of other cool Slytherins. My family's just a bit partial to Gryffindor, that's all." He smiled apologetically, a peace offering, and Sirius smiled back. "Nah, don't worry about it. My family's the worst." He made a valiant effort to laugh, and James chuckled awkwardly with him. "I'm sure I'll get stuck in Hufflepuff," Peter moaned, flopping back onto the seat. And for once Sirius was grateful for his complaining. "Now, come on, Pete, don't talk like that. Hufflepuff's cool too. All the houses are great." It sounded as if the two friends had already had this conversation, or iterations of it, many, many times. Sirius leaned back and glanced over at Remus. His whole explanation had been for his benefit, after all. But Lupin was staring out of the window, watching the trees fly by, looking as if he wasn't paying attention to any of them at all. Sirius thought his heart might beat its way out of his chest. He didn't even glance down as their boat sliced through the dark water of the lake, although normally he would have been entranced. The sweeping stairways, the stone columns, even the starry ceiling, all of it hardly registered. The castle was magnificent, but Sirius Black was used to magnificence. He hadn't expected anything less. So as they entered the great hall, full of chattering students, More children in one room than Sirius had ever seen, all different sorts, and they were all turning to look. His focus was entirely on the shabby hat propped up on a little wooden stool. The sorting hat. Sirius tried to swallow, but it felt like there was a brick in his throat. At the Slytherin table, he could feel Narcissa and Bellatrix staring at him. When he looked over, they smirked. "This is it, then," Sirius thought as Professor McGonagall began calling names. Slytherin. He'd always known it was coming. All thoughts of Hogwarts were inextricably bound up with Slytherin, where he would spend the next 7 years. His whole family went on about it for ages, any time school was brought up. All the wonderful memories and crucial connections, the like-minded people, the pure blood. Slytherin had the lowest Muggle-born acceptance rate in any house at Hogwarts. Sirius tried to find the excitement that he'd felt just a few hours earlier buzzing in his chest. But the train ride had done something funny to his head. He liked James. He liked the way James talked about Gryffindor most of all. He liked not having to think about his bloody family, even just for a short while. Sirius knew he should be thrilled at the prospect of walking over to take a seat next to his cousins, but looking at them, all he felt was a cold wash of dread. Sirius Black! He still couldn't swallow. Walking up to the little stool, Sirius thought he might be sick. "Pull it together," he chastised himself. "This is all you've ever wanted. You're at Hogwarts." It would be just like the wand ceremony, he told himself. His parents would be so proud, wouldn't they? Wouldn't they? It was the last thought Sirius had before the hat settled onto his head. "Ah, another black," the hat said. His voice was gruff. Sirius felt like it was scratching inside of his head. "Suppose this one should be easy, eh?" Right. The hat was right. It should be easy. Any second now, it would call out the name. But what is this? And his parents would be proud, and they definitely would. And wasn't that what he wanted? What you want, eh? Sirius cringed, realizing the hat could read his thoughts. But he couldn't stop himself from thinking. It was a good enough reason to go to Slytherin, wasn't it? To make his family proud. And he'd have Reg to think about. He'd have to look out for Reg. Very interesting, young Sirius. Very interesting indeed. If this stupid hat would just shut up and get on with it, then everything would be fine. He just needed to say, "Gryffindor!" Sirius's heart leapt into his throat. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. But people were starting to clap now, and McGonagall had already taken the hat. She was calling the next name, and Sissy and Bella... Oh no, they were looking at him. His mother would know before the night was out, wouldn't she? How had she messed up this badly? All he'd had to do was wear the stupid hat. Sirius stood, stiffly, walking over to the Gryffindor tables. He could feel the Slytherin staring at him as he sat down. Traitor. He was the first student to sit down at the Gryffindor table, and he got a few pats on the back and the good-natured smiles, along with a few wary looks, presumably from students who were familiar with his family name. At the front, the sorting continued on, but Sirius found himself unable to pay attention. A failure. A complete and utter failure. That's what he was. A disappointment to their family. He could imagine exactly what his mother would say if she was here with him. Sirius felt very small and very alone, even though he was surrounded by cheering Gryffindors. He perked up a bit when Remus Lupin got sorted into Gryffindor, though they'd barely said 2 words to each other on the train. He'd smiled at Sirius at the station. Surely that meant he wanted to be friends, right? But Remus sat down and stared doggedly at his plate, as though determined not to make conversation. Sirius frowned. He was surprised when Peter got sorted into Gryffindor. Privately, he'd agreed with the small boy on the train when he said he was going to be in Hufflepuff. It wasn't until James got sorted, the hat was barely on his head for 2 seconds before it called out Gryffindor, that Sirius began to feel a tiny bit better. At least he'd have one friend. Remus still hadn't said a word, and Peter seemed to be too anxious to speak to him. "How great is that?" James said, grinning broadly as he sat down. "We all made it." He made it sound like a grand achievement. Sirius groaned. his head in his arms on the table. "Speak for yourself," he replied, slightly muffled. "My father's going to kill me." It was so much easier to say father than mother. Sirius didn't want to think about what his mother would do. "I can't believe it," Peter kept saying, eyes wide. He shuffled a bit closer to James, darting glances around the room like he thought someone might come and drag him away from the table. Sirius thought he was acting ridiculous, so he was a bit surprised when McGonagall actually did walk over, but placed a hand on Remus's shoulder, not Peter's. "Mr. Lupin," she muttered, "if you would come to my office after dinner. It's right next to the Gryffindor common room. One of the prefects can show you." Remus nodded mutely, and she left. "What's that about?" James asked. "McGonagall wants to see you already." Remus looked at them, shoulders hunched forward slightly, as though he was trying to protect himself from their attention. He kept his face blank, but Sirius peered at his eyes, which were wary and perhaps a little bit frightened, like a stray dog backed into a corner. They waited for an answer, but he only shrugged. "He's got a secret," Sirius thought, and for a moment he forgot to be miserable. After the food had appeared and they'd all stuffed themselves silly, they followed one of the prefects, Frank Longbottom, into their common room. They were just about to enter when James grabbed Sirius's arm. "Oi, hang back a minute, lads. Let's see if Remus wants us to wait for him." Sirius blinked, then shrugged. Remus still hadn't said a word to them since getting on the train, but he supposed it couldn't hurt. Peter looked a bit put out, but they both trailed behind James as he jogged down the corridor towards McGonagall's office. When they arrived outside the door, Remus was nowhere to be found. "Well?" Peter asked. "Are we waiting?" "No, you go ahead," James replied, smiling. Peter glanced at Sirius. "Aren't you coming with us?" "I'll stick around for a bit. He missed the password from Frank." Peter wrung his hands nervously, glancing between James and Sirius as if unsure whether he should offer to stay as well. "Oh, come on then," Sirius sighed, rolling his eyes. He was too tired to stand out in the hallway until Remus's secret meeting was over. It wasn't as if any of them knew how long it would take. After a moment of hesitation, Peter followed him back to their room. The Gryffindor common room was lovely, all decked out in red and gold, with plush armchairs and a thick carpet. Their room wasn't half bad either, although it would be Sirius's first time sharing a bedroom, and it was a bit cramped for his liking, with the 4 massive beds. He flopped onto his mattress as Peter began digging through his trunk. Gryffindor. All of the rotten luck he had to get stuck in bloody Gryffindor. He suspected it was better than Hufflepuff. His mother would have lost her mind if he'd ended up there. He'd heard her rants about the number of Muggle-borns they accepted. Still, Sirius felt hollowed out. With the wand and everything, he'd thought maybe, he'd wondered maybe if he was really meant to be a Black. If all his worries about not fitting in, or fitting wrong, had been... Sirius sighed, rolling onto his back. It didn't matter now. Here was proof that he'd known secretly to be true. He didn't belong. He was a disappointment. If his parents didn't know by now, they would tomorrow, and he had no doubt that Bellatrix would be racing around the owlery to spread the news. She'd always seemed to get a kick out of it whenever Sirius slipped up. And this, of course, was much more than a simple mistake. This was permanent. The door to their room swung open, and James came in. Remus followed behind him, eyes bulging slightly as he looked at the room. Sirius sat up, watching them, curious. Remus was staring around the room like he couldn't believe his eyes. As he looked at the velvet-draped beds and dark wooden trunks, something hardened in his face, as if he'd come to some private decision. Sirius couldn't help but wonder what that was about. Peter was still rifling through his trunk, growing more and more frantic as he pulled clothes out and magazines and books, making a terrible mess. "I can't find my wand," he wailed. "Mum made me pack it so I wouldn't lose it on the train, but it's not here." "Pete," James grinned. "Your mum asked me to look after it, remember?" James and Peter, Sirius had learnt at dinner, had grown up as neighbours and knew each other quite well. That explained why James was so kind to Peter. Sirius had wondered what the two could possibly have in common. When James noticed Sirius skulking, he smiled. Cheer up, mate, James said, sitting next to him on his bed. You didn't want to be a Slytherin anyway, did you? He said it with such confidence, as though it was so obvious. Still the question echoed in Sirius's head. Did you? Did you? What did you want? 500 years. His voice was stony as he replied. Every black at Hogwarts has been sorted into Slytherin for 500 years. Well, it's about time someone tried to be different then, eh? James slapped him on the back jovially. Sirius felt a sudden surge of emotion. He wasn't sure what it was about James Potter, the smile, the happy confidence, but somehow hearing him talk like things would be all right made Sirius feel as if, maybe, they really would be all right. After all, it was true, wasn't it? Sirius hadn't wanted to be a Slytherin, not really, and he really did love the colour red. If I'm going to be the family disappointment, Sirius thought, moving to his trunk, I'll be the best bloody disappointment they ever had. He started to unpack, pulling out the books Andromeda had kept for him. There were quite a few of them. He had to stack the ones that didn't fit on the shelf next to his bed. You know, James said, as Sirius continued stacking books, there is a library here. Sirius smirked. I know, but these are mostly Muggle books. My Uncle Alfred left them to me, and Mum would set them all on fire if I left them at home. Peter's eyes widened at that, and he glanced curiously at the books, which made Sirius feel extremely cool. Once he was finished with the books, he pulled out his record player, followed by a box of records in shining cellophane sleeves. Andromeda was truly, truly the best. Sirius had barely set them down before Remus came over, eyes wide with wonder. Is that Abbey Road? He asked, peering down at the box of vinyl. That wary look was gone momentarily from his eyes. Yeah, Sirius grinned, holding them to him. Remus wiped his hand carefully over his robes before taking it, as though the record were something fragile and precious. You must be a Muggle-born, Sirius said. I've never met a wizard who knows the Beatles, except my cousin, Andromeda. She bought them for me. He'd been wanting to ask about it, but he wasn't sure how to bring it up. He didn't want the others to think that he was like the rest of his family, obsessed with blood purity. But Sirius was really curious. Remus seemed to be so surprised by everything at Hogwarts. Remus nodded, though it seemed like he was only half listening. I love the Beatles. One of my boys in my room at home's got at least 10 singles, but he never lets me touch them. Boys at home? Sirius arched an eyebrow. Was that something Muggles said? You mean your brother? No. Remus's eyes shuttered. He shook his head. He handed the record back to Sirius and retreated, shoulders hunching up again. I live in a children's home. Like an orphanage? Peter asked, eyes wide. Remus's eyes went flat and dark, brow tugging down. No, he spat, and Sirius waited for him to say something else. But he didn't, only turned and kept unpacking. Sirius desperately wanted to ask him more questions, but he could see that Remus was going silent on them again. What was a children's home? What was it if it wasn't an orphanage? Were there no adults? Was that how Remus had got the black eye, fighting with other kids? He certainly seemed quite the type to throw a punch, with the way he glared at Peter when he asked the question. Eventually, Sirius asked James about his Quidditch poster, just to break the awkward silence, and their conversation quickly turned into a very heated argument. They were still debating the last line of the Chudley Canons when Remus climbed into his bed and pulled the curtains shut. There was a pause before Peter whispered loudly, "Do you think he tried harder to make friends, especially if he's Muggle-born?" Sirius stiffened. He thought that one of the only good things about failing to be placed in Slytherin was that he'd be away from all that nonsense. And besides, Remus seemed to be much cooler than Peter. He obviously had good taste in music. "Are you sure the hat wasn't supposed to put you in Slytherin?" Sirius drawled, and Peter promptly shut up.